turn. Secretariat is blazing along. The first 3/4 of a mile in 109 4/5. Secretariat is widening now. He is moving like a tremendous machine. Secretariat is all alone. He's out there almost a 16th of a mile away from the rest of the horses. Secretariat is in a position that is impossible to get. Secretariat has opened a 22-length lead. He is going to be the Triple Crown winner. Here comes Secretariat to the wire. An unbelievable, an amazing performance. He hits the finish 25 lengths in front. It's going to be Tyson for second. My Gallant third.
For 50 years, this picture of Secretariat has been the gold standard of horse racing. It's an inflection point where you have everything that came before and everything after, but this one moment is different. For many of you, this video is going to be pretty controversial. Let me just say up front that I believe Secretariat is one of, if not the very best American dirt horse of all time. He was spectacular, and mechanically one of the very best moving horses anyone has ever seen. So if you're a true believer, I'm not trying to change your mind. I am, however, trying to put context around Secretariat's summer and fall of 1973. And if I'm not trying to change your mind, I want to at least give you pause about the degree to which you proclaim him to be the best ever, especially when so many other great horses have been just as spectacular, but for different reasons. But those reasons are hard to put into sound bites because they take explanation and nuance and a deeper understanding of the forces at play. It's much easier to say 224 flat and 31 lengths is the greatest performance ever and then let the myth grow. No one wants to admit that the field that day at Belmont was god-awful. That collectively the other four horses would end up being 14 for 86 lifetime. And only two horses, My Gallant and Sham, would ever win a major purse, and only then in races that were age restricted for 3-year-olds. In fact, there's no evidence that Sham himself was some sort of unfortunate champion that lived in the shadow of Secretariat. He was a modest 5 for 13 lifetime. It's hardly the stuff of legends. By the time that Belmont came around, Sham was pretty clearly over the top in his training. And with no other real challengers, Secretariat won by 31 lengths. Because he should have. It was like dropping prime Michael Jordan into a pickup game at his local gym. But just talking about the lack of competition in a single race shouldn't really take away from a horse that won the first Triple Crown in 25 years and set 3 records in the process. In fact, he set several more track records and world records outside of the Triple Crown. And we need to look at that to fully understand what was happening in 1973. This is the late great Charlie Whittingham. He once famously quipped that time only mattered if you were trying to catch a bus or sitting in jail. And what he meant was, time is a pretty unreliable way to compare racehorses, especially when you're talking about over weeks or days or months or decades. As an example, this is the top rated horse in the world, Equinox, winning the Tenno show in Japan just a few months ago. In this race he draws off, wins by 2.5 lengths, and sets a world record for 2,000 meters, 1.25 miles, in 1:55 2. It's an absolutely cartoonish time. Just for some perspective, Secretariat's race in the Kentucky Derby was 20 lengths slower than this one. But I have one other issue with this race. This is a screen capture from just at the end of the race as the horses hit the finish line. Equinox 2.5 lengths in front, second place horse around a length in front of the third and fourth place horses. But the previous record was 1:56 1, which means that the second place horse broke the world record and the third and fourth place horses equaled it. Is it possible that 4 of the best 2,000 meter horses of all time all showed up in this race? I suppose it's possible. It just isn't very likely. Anyone who follows Japanese racing knows that over the last 2 decades, race times have been falling drastically because they build and maintain their tracks to be extremely level, like a pool table. And track condition is one of the 3 most important components when talking about track records, along with pace scenario and yes, horse's ability. But track condition may in fact be the most important component. Because like we see in this race with Equinox, a track that's playing really fast can amplify a horse's ability, or even multiple horses' ability in the same race. And it was no different in 1973. This is Secretariat winning the Marlboro Cup in September of 1973. It was originally supposed to be a match race between Secretariat and his stellar stablemate Riva Ridge. But when Secretariat lost the Woodward, they decided to open it up to an invitational, inviting Onion, who beat Secretariat in the Whitney, and the excellent handicap horse from California, Cougar 2. And in this race, Secretariat bounces back from his previous defeat, beats Riva Ridge, wins by 2.5 lengths, and sets a world record of 145-2 for 9 furlongs. What's interesting about this race is that, like the Tenno Show with Equinox, Riva Ridge also breaks the world record, and Cougar 2, back in third, equals it. But what's even more interesting about this race is that just 30 minutes before, the top filly Desert Vixen also equaled the world record for 9 furlongs when she won the Belding. These two events, just 30 minutes apart, made me start to wonder, was there something else happening in the summer and fall of 1973 that started to produce faster times? And then I heard this call from Chick Anderson.
In the stretch, went away to win this race, and he won it with authority. And incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, this was a nice, fast racetrack today, but don't let that take anything away from it. Secretariat just broke the old Kentucky Derby record.
Did you catch that? Just before he announces Secretariat's new track record, he precedes it with a caveat, saying that even though he knows it's a fast racetrack that day, we shouldn't let that take anything away from him. And when he says fast racetrack, I don't think he's talking about how the track isn't muddy or sloppy or anything like that. I think what he's saying is the track had already been producing fast times that day. Now, this happened 50 years ago, and they just didn't keep great records about the races that happen on the Derby undercard, so those are hard to find. But like the previous race, this did encourage me to go and look for more evidence, and I found it. I found a lot more evidence. Because Secretariat wasn't the only horse running fast times that year, or even close to being the only horse. In fact, he wasn't even the only horse in his own barn. His stablemate Riva Ridge set 3 speed records that season, including a world record for 1 mile and 3/16 and a 9 furlong record of 147 flat that still stands today at Aqueduct. And before Onion had beat Secretariat in the Whitney Stakes earlier that season, he had set a track record for 6 furlongs. And by the time Prove Out had beaten Secretariat in the Woodward, he had already set 2 track records that summer. Once beating the Great Vorgo at 7 furlongs, and then for 1 mile and a 16th. And these are just a couple of examples. During my research, I found that between May 1st and October 1st of 1973, there were more than 30 races that had records that were either equaled or broken. To put that into some context, during the last 30 years, I've probably personally watched more than 100,000 races. And during that time, I think that I can count on my fingers and toes the number of times I've seen a horse equal or break a track record. But if I'd been paying close attention in the summer and fall of 1973, I would have had the opportunity to see a track record broken nearly every 4 days. So what was going on here? Why this sudden onslaught of speed that we hadn't really seen before? I think to fully understand what was happening in 1973, you first have to go back to 1972. Because in that year, the British Horse Racing Authority announced their new group race designation, where the most historically relevant and most competitive races would be designated Group 1, Group 2, or Group 3, with famous races like the Epsom Derby or the 1 and 2,000 Guineas being the highest graded at Group 1. And in an effort to promote consistency across the Atlantic, they asked their North American counterparts to implement a similar system. So in 1974, the new North American graded rating system made its debut. with them retroactively adding graded distinctions to races from 1973, because that was the year that they used data from. The problem arose because, unlike in Britain, where the Jockey Club holds unilateral power to make decisions, in North America, the power resides with various racing commissions that are run by states. So instead of working as a collective like they did in Britain, here in the United States, they were suddenly in competition with each other. So if you were a racing secretary in 1973 and you wanted to grab one of these new valuable race distinctions for your premier races of the season, you really only had three choices. You could offer more competitive rates to handicap horses, you could offer more money in purses, or you could try and grab headlines. And what grabs a headline better than a track record? And this isn't a conspiracy theory. We know that track manipulation happens. That's why big race meets like Kentucky Derby Week or Breeders' Cup Weekend produce such fast times as opposed to other times of the year. Add a little bit of water at the right time, harrow it at the right time, roll it at the right time, and the materials in a track will start to hold together better and keep more uniform. The difference between today and 1973 is that racetracks are far more concerned about safety and are unlikely to push a surface to the point that it becomes dangerous for the horses. And if you go back and speak to people who were actually around the Belmont racetrack when Secretariat made his amazing run, there's a handful of them that will tell you this performance is a lie. Because in that same Belmont meet where Secretariat ran this unbelievable race, low-level claimers ran 6 furlongs in 109 and change, when the average for that level of competition should have been more around 111. So it is possible that everybody's been right all along. This race in the Belmont will never be replicated, but that's because the horse himself, Secretariat, couldn't replicate it either. This may look familiar, but it's not the Belmont Stakes. This is actually the 1973 Woodward. And in it, we see jockey Ron Turcotte make the same move he did to win the Belmont, where he grabs the lead in the backstretch and tries to build that all the way to the far turn. But this field in the Woodward is far, far, far superior to the field that he faced in the Belmont Stakes just a few months earlier. And in the context of racing history, Secretariat losing this race makes a lot of sense. Just 5 years later, we would see the 4-year-old Seattle Slew defeat the 3-year-old Affirmed. And then a year after that, the 4-year-old Affirmed defeat the 3-year-old Spectacular Bid. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise that Secretariat would lose the more experienced Prove Out, a horse that was far more along in his development. But the expectation was that Secretariat was going to do what he did in the Belmont Stakes, and that didn't happen. And then after this race, there were all kinds of excuses that came out. That Secretariat hadn't been pointing to this race that Riva Ridge had, but then when the racetrack came up wet, they decided to run Secretariat. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense when you realize that 2 weeks before this race, Secretariat set a world record in the Marlboro Cup. And then 2 weeks after this race, he would set a track record in the Man of War on turf. So it wasn't like Secretariat wasn't fit. He was in one of the greatest runs we've ever seen a horse make. But because he didn't do what he had done in the Belmont Stakes, people said that this race didn't count. But for me personally, his time in this race of 2:26 and 2, beaten 4.5 lengths, makes a lot of sense in comparison to the time he set 2 weeks later in the Man of War of 2:24 and 4/5. Because you have to consider that turf tracks are typically a full second faster than their dirt counterparts. So these two performances match up really well. So it gets harder to reconcile that this horse had run 2:24 flat, but then in his 2 performances at 12 furlongs after that, he can't even really get close. And that's because the Woodward Stakes and the Man of War were run in October of 1973, and by October, the artificial speed in these tracks had kind of dried up. So it leaves us to wonder, what does the racing world look like if Secretariat wins the Belmont by 31 lengths, but his time is more like 2:25 and 3? I think it might leave us a little bit more room to appreciate horses like Easy Goer, who ran the Belmont in 2:26 flat, or American Pharaoh, who won the Triple Crown and completed the Belmont in 2:26 and 4. it might even give us a better appreciation of this horse Prove Out, who in winning the Woodward completed the race in 2:25 and 4, which to this day is still the second fastest 12 furlongs on dirt ever recorded, second only behind Secretariat's 2:24 flat. At the end of the day, I'm not trying to change your mind about Secretariat. As I said, he was spectacular. But I am trying to open your hearts and minds to the possibility that there are other great horses that you would get just as much enjoyment out of watching. Before I leave you, I want to point out one more thing. That this might not be the first time that a legendary horse had benefited from a supercharged racetrack. At the end of World War I, the New York Jockey Club decided to resurface all of the tracks in their jurisdiction. Better materials, better drainage, and better maintenance. And that this new surface was really successful. In fact, it was so successful that local newspapers started referring to it as the rubber racetrack. And then little more than a year later, Man o' War made its debut. Thank you for watching In the Blood. I'll see you guys next time.